Right. So if you have a Bible nearby, go ahead and grab it now. You can also look up one online. And either way, we will be having the text we'll be looking at today up on the screen. So you'll be able to follow along. And I'll get that screen share going in just a moment so that we can get started. Right. So after God has rescued Israel out of slavery in Egypt, he brings them to a land he promised them. He brings them to Canaan. They settle there for a while and they are ruled by what we call judges. Now, we explored this on a previous week here at the house where we looked at the story of the Ebenezer stone in 2 Samuel. And some of you may remember that in that same study, we explored how the Israelites worshiped the gods of other nations which surrounded them, in essence, worshiping their enemies' gods. Well, after a while of having judges as their rulers, Israel decides that they want a king to rule over them. The first king they appoint is Saul, followed by a king. God appoints a man named David. And from David begins a long line of kings, all from the tribe of Judah, the Israelite tribe, which was David's own tribe. After his reign, David dies, and his son Solomon takes the throne, and after his rule, he dies as well. And from there on begins this long timeline of turbulent years of kings reigning over Israel. Over the generations, as one king dies and his son takes the throne, the overall rule of kings seems to become worse and worse. The kings become increasingly violent, more and more suffering is caused because of it, and a good king becomes few and far between. In this context today, we will be looking at a story found in the book of 2 Kings and the book of 2 Chronicles. We enter the story just as the old king Hezekiah dies. The year at this point is 687 BC, and as always, his eldest son Manasseh takes the throne after him. Now, we as readers are coming fresh to this character, and we might think, I wonder what sort of king Manasseh is going to be. Well, the text tells us, as we read in 2 Kings chapter 21, where it says, "He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites." He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He also erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. So we are told about this new king, Manasseh, and the text says he does evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, it appears based on the text that Hezekiah, his father, had destroyed many of what we call high places in Israel, which refers to idol altars kept on high points or hills around the country on which people would sacrifice to idols. What Manasseh does is to rebuild them. He erects altars to the Canaanite god Baal, and also makes an Asherah pole, which was done to evoke the Canaanite goddess of fertility. And we also read that he bows down to all the starry hosts and worships them. So he worships stars as though they are gods. This to some Bible readers may sound pretty bad. And to modern readers, it can also be easy to misunderstand how big of a deal his actions were unless we dig a little bit deeper, a little bit more under the surface, and understand what these various practices actually involved. So, to understand what happens when Manasseh erects altars to Baal, He is reinstating child sacrifice. The Canaanites believed that Baal was the highest god. He was the god of life. And for things to go well with you, you could sacrifice to him, namely your infant child. So by Manasseh reinstating Baal worship, he is killing, in essence, thousands of innocent lives. Alas, the description of Manasseh doesn't end there. We turn to the text in verse 4 and carry on reading. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, on which the Lord had said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." In the two courts of the temple of the Lord he built altars to all the starry hosts. So not only does Manasseh build altars to other gods and idols all over the country, he builds them inside the temple in Jerusalem. The temple where God was meant to be physically living, he builds these altars. And it says in verse 6, he sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced divination, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. So King Manasseh goes as far as to sacrifice one of his own children, thinking, if I sacrifice my child, things will go well for me. And just as a little side note here, as modern readers, I think we can find such practices seem very barbaric and also very far removed from our present society. But the truth is that the lie that if you sacrifice your child or someone who is within your care or vulnerable, that things will somehow go well with you or that you will be more successful, that lie continues to circulate as a spirit of the age that doesn't really disappear just because Baal worship has. But so to carry on, verse 7. He took the carved Asherah pole he had made and put it in the temple, of which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, "In this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever." So God had earlier said this, but he also tries to speak directly to Manasseh and to the people. And we read this in 2 Chronicles 33. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. And here in 2 Kings 21 as well, we read, but the people did not listen. Manasseh led them astray so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. So Manasseh leads the people to being worse than those considered to be God's enemies. Verse 16. Moreover, Manasseh also shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end, besides the sin that he had caused Judah to commit, so that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Manasseh ruled Israel for 55 years. Now, this is a dark time, and here we have a description of the state of Israel, where it says in verse 9, Manasseh led the people to become more evil than the nations which surrounded them, not equally bad, worse. After 55 long years of this, we read in verse 18, Manasseh rested finally with his ancestors and was buried in his palace garden, the garden of Uzzah, and Amon his son succeeded him as king. King Manasseh is finally gone after 55 years, and his son Amon is now taking the throne. And as with each king, we can't help but wonder, what sort of king will Amon be? Well, let's read verse 19. Amon was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 2 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord as his father Manasseh had done. He followed completely the ways of his father, worshipping the idols his father had worshipped and bowing down to them. He forsook the Lord, the God of his ancestors, and did not walk in obedience to them. So he completely followed the ways of his father. The apple hasn't fallen far from the tree. That same violence, that same oppression, the same darkness, and you can see here like father, like son. Well, as you may have noticed, Ammon didn't have a very long reign, nowhere near as long as Manasseh. As it's said in 2 Kings, Ammon's officials conspired against him and assassinated the king in his palace. So here in chapter 21, we are told, it is revealed why he had such a short reign. After 2 years on the throne, Ammon's officials have had enough. They plot against him and kill him in his own home. Verse 26, he was buried in his tomb in the garden of Uzzah, and Josiah his son succeeded him as king. And at this point, once more, we wonder, what sort of king will this be? Israel has been under 57 years of darkness now. It seems that in this family, sons follow in their father's footsteps. Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's carry on reading. At the time Josiah is made king, as we can see in the text, he is 8 years old. So when he's 8, people come to him and tell him, your father has been murdered. And oh yeah, you're replacing him. It's not difficult to imagine that he may have felt scared and like his childhood was definitely over. Imagine what it's like to be Josiah. He'd grown up in the royal palace. He'd watched his grandfather and father. He wondered whether one of his younger siblings would be sacrificed just because the king wanted his life to go well. He had been taught only idol worship and violence by 2 generations in his family, and now he has the trauma of having his father murdered in their own home. These are the sort of male role models, fatherly leadership in Josiah's life. You don't have to be an expert to figure out that this kid is likely going to be pretty messed up. But let's continue reading. After his coronation at the age of 8, he takes the throne, and he must have seemed tiny. Sitting on that throne, the crown too big for him, his legs swinging off the edge. Well, what happens now? After he is coronated, you can simply ask what is going to happen. 2 Chronicles 34. In the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, he began to seek the God of his father, David. So Josiah has turned 16 and he begins to seek the God of David. I mean, right there, that's a miracle. Who told him to do that? Why would he do that? In the same verse, in his 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places, Asherah poles, and idols. So Josiah is a young teenager at this point. He begins to undo what his grandfather and father had been doing in Israel. Verse 4. Under his direction, the altars of the Baals were torn down. He cut to pieces the incense altars that were above them and smashed the Asherah poles and the idols. Verse 6 and 7. In the towns of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and in the ruins above them, he tore down the altars and the Asherah poles and crushed the idols to powder, and cut to pieces all the incense altars throughout Israel. Then he went back to Jerusalem. This young king does not remain dormant or safely tucked behind the palace doors. He gets up, he goes out, travels throughout the country, and he now completely ended, as far as he can, by royal decree, infant sacrificing in Israel. But Josiah isn't done yet, and he doesn't stop there. One day, when Josiah is older, he is looking out the window of his palace, and he looks over at the neighboring hill where the temple of God lies. And after thinking, he calls for his secretary. Now, King Josiah had, as many kings do, a secretary or advisor, so an administrator, someone who would hear his commands and then go apply them. Josiah's secretary was a man called Shaphan. And Josiah calls for Shaphan, and he also calls for Joah, who is a recorder, like a note taker in meetings. And Josiah says, Shaphan, I want you to go to the temple and do something for me. So, from the days of Manasseh, if you remember, Manasseh placed in the temples idols and altars to other gods. Now, when he did this, obviously the sin offerings and the prayers to God would have probably have ceased. This meant that for all those years, the priests in the temple, those that we call the Levites or the Levitical priests, are without a job, seemingly. But Manasseh ordered them to conduct a new job. He made them gatekeepers and money collectors, which simply means the Levite priests who used to pray to God and help people who have sinned to reunite with God now stood at the opening of the temple with a box in their hand, and they were collecting money from any people who wanted to enter the temple to pray or to sacrifice. They are basically overglorified offering collectors. The money which was collected was then brought and given to Manasseh. So King Manasseh was in essence charging people for trying to access God or the gods. He was personally making profit off them and lining his pockets with his earnings. And in the meantime, during those dark years, what happens is that the temple isn't taken care of. The walls are beginning to crumble. Some stones are missing. The sanctuary is collecting dust. It's a complete mess in there. The whole structure is beginning to fall apart. And the house of God, the place where he's meant to live, is in shambles. But there's a young king in Jerusalem who that day decides to change things. So as we said, King Josiah sends for Shaphan and he says, Shaphan, I want you to go to the temple for me and talk to Hilkiah, the high priest. Now, Hilkiah must have been both confused and maybe worried when he saw the king's secretary walk through the temple doors. Because as you know, Hilkiah and the other priests haven't really been working as Levitical priests for years. And he wonders, what's this new king up to now? And this is what Josiah had told Shaphan to do. They went to Hilkiah the high priest and gave him the money that had been brought into the temple of God, which the Levites, who were the gatekeepers, had collected from the people of Manasseh, Ephraim, and the entire remnant of Israel, and from all the people of Judah and Benjamin, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So King Josiah is taking all the money his grandfather and his father had taken from the people, and he sends every single coin back to Hilkiah, the high priest. And the money comes with a message from the king. use this to repair the temple. Not only does Josiah command that God's temple be repaired, but he says, we're not going to do this through slavery or through forced labor, as it says in verse 10. Then they entrusted it, that is the money, to the men appointed to supervise the work on the Lord's temple. These men paid the workers who repaired and restored the temple. They also gave money to the carpenters and builders to purchase dressed stone and timber for joists and beams for the buildings that the kings of Judah had allowed to fall into ruin. The workers labored faithfully. And verse 12, the Levites, all who were skilled in playing musical instruments, had charge of the laborers and supervised all the workers from job to job. Some of the Levites were secretaries, scribes, and gatekeepers. So things are really beginning to happen in Jerusalem. Josiah orders the temple to be repaired, and every worker is to be paid for his job. And he allows not himself, but the Levite priests themselves to oversee the project. The priests knew what God had commanded the temple should look like, and Josiah is delegating. He's letting them take the point on this one. Good leadership move. And again, almost engaging them in returning to their more Levitical duties and care of the temple. And it seems that everyone involved feels treated fairly and with respect because, as it says, the workers worked faithfully. And in 2 Kings 22, Josiah also says of those working, but they don't have to account for the money entrusted to them because they are honest in their dealings. Again, another good leadership move. Josiah even says, look, I'm not going to micromanage you. We don't have to monitor how you're using the money. I'm trusting these people to do a good job. So, as we said, Shaphan speaks to Hilkiah, and Hilkiah says, yes, I think we also have some more money in the back we've collected from people here in the temple. Let me just go and get it for you. So Hilkiah rummages through the dusty, messy temple storage area, if we can call it that. Where did I put that money again? And then we read in verses 14 to 15. While they were bringing out the money that had been taken into the temple of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of the Lord that had been given through Moses. Hilkiah said to Shaphan the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the temple of the Lord. He gave it to Shaphan. Hold on. Okay, so Hilkiah the priest goes to look for money and his eye catches sight of something, some clay jars. He opens the first jar and his eyes grow big. He has found the book of the law. First of all, when you read the book of the law phrase, we are literally referring to the 5 first books of the Bible. The Jews called this collection the book of the law, sometimes the book of the covenant. Secondly, how much in a state of ruins did not only the temple have to be, but the faith of the Israelites have to be for the book of the law to be lost? It was clearly lost because it was just found, and if it was lost, nobody's reading it. And for how long has it been lost? Well, we can guess that at least since the rule of Manasseh began. So for at least 57 years, no one has read those scrolls. And it's not like there was a bunch of copies running around. There's not a local library. This meant that a whole generation living in Israel at the time had never heard the book of the law. And as Hilkiah hands those precious scrolls to Shaphan, Shaphan's mouth must have dropped open. He doesn't lose a single moment. He stops what he's doing and he walks hurriedly from the temple all the way back to the palace, where he comes before the king. Let's see what happens. Then Shaphan the secretary informed the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read it from it in the presence of the king. Notice Shaphan here doesn't even tell Josiah what the book is. You can tell maybe that he's weary, perhaps he's worried because Josiah seems to be in a good track, but he remembers who his grandfather and father were. You never know what might happen or how the king might react. So the secretary simply says, "A book has been found, my lord." And naturally the king says, "Well, all right, read it. What is it?" And Shaphan reads the book out loud to Josiah. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And as Shaphan reads how God is the creator of the world, his covenant with Abraham, how God rescues the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, Shaphan finally arrives at the story at Mount Sinai where the covenant is made there with the people. And the young king, who has likely been sitting on the edge of his seat the whole time, his expression now changes more and more. And as Shaphan arrives at the giving of the law at Sinai, the king can't take it anymore, and he tears his royal robe in grief. When the king heard the words of the law, he tore his robes. Josiah had been seeking God from a young age. He tried to do the right thing by smashing the idols and now repairing the temple. And all this happened even though Josiah had never read the scriptures. He had never read the law. He hadn't been taught in full or in depth the history of Israel. He hadn't had access to scriptures, and still he reached out for God, tried to do the right thing, and it appears that God reached back. And now Josiah hears the full story of his people for the first time in his life. And all those lies his father had told him about gods and violence and how the world works are swallowed up in this story of a faithful, rescuing, kind God. And what he's only been catching a glimpse of his whole life, and what he's been trying to move forward, stumbling through, now opens up more to him. And he is completely overwhelmed with grief, because he sees now more clearly than ever before just how far his forefathers and his people have gone from God. And it absolutely breaks his heart. Now, any other person at this point might go, "Well, you know what? This document makes us look really bad. I'm uncomfortable. I don't really want to learn more about this God, so let's just pop this particular book back on the shelf." But not Josiah, because he's not that kind of king. Instead, Josiah sends a message to Hilkiah, the high priest, once more, saying, "Go and speak to the Lord for me, for the people and for all Judah about what is written in this scroll which has been found. For the Lord must be furious at us, since our ancestor did not listen to the words written in the scroll and didn't do everything written there that concerns us." So King Josiah says, "Hilkiah, you're the priest in the temple. You're the high priest. Return to what priests used to do. Pray to God on the people's behalf. We need to seek forgiveness, and we've already gone down the wrong path." Now Hilkiah goes to speak to a prophet, a woman named Huldah, and we read this in verse 22. Huldah responds that yes, the people have done wrong, and she concludes with saying, "Tell the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of the Lord, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you heard. Because your heart was responsive, and you humbled yourself before God when you heard what he spoke against his place and its people, and because you humbled yourself before me and tore your robes and wept in my presence, I have heard you, declares the Lord." Now, this is good news. It returns to Josiah, and he could have been happy with this, saying, well, things seem to be going all right with me. Things are well with me. At least I'm okay with God. But that's not what Josiah does. After the words of Huldah are reported back to him, he does this. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of the Lord with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the Levites, all the people from the least to the greatest. The king gathers together the people of Judah, everyone living in Jerusalem, each person from the highest position to the lowest, and they all march together up that hill to the temple, led there by their king Josiah. End of verse 30. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. So not only does Josiah hear the words of the book of the law, he now makes everyone hear it. He makes sure everyone can hear it. He himself reads out loud the words of Genesis, Exodus, through to Deuteronomy, saying to his people, this is your history. This is what we've forgotten and abandoned. And then verse 31, they are still in the temple. The king stood by his pillar and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord, to follow the Lord and keep his commands, statutes and decrees with all his heart and all his soul, and to obey the words of the covenant written in this book. So Josiah, in front of all the people, comes in front of the most holy place in the temple, the tabernacle, where the presence of God was meant to be. And he says, please, I want to renew our relationship, to follow you. Verse 32. Then he had everyone in Jerusalem and Benjamin pledge themselves to it. The people of Jerusalem did this in accordance with the covenant of God and the God of their ancestors. So first the king leads by example and humbly approaches God for a reconnection of a lost relationship. And then the people do the same. Verse 33. Josiah removed all the detestable idols from all the territory belonging to the Israelites, and had all who were present in Israel serve the Lord their God. As long as he lived, they did not fail to follow the Lord, the God of their ancestors. But Josiah isn't done there. When he's 26, we are told of more he does in 2 Kings chapter 23. For example, Josiah gathers together priests who were scattered all over the country and bring them back to Jerusalem to again be taught how to serve God and not idols. In verse 8, he breaks down something called the Gate of Joshua. Now, this isn't Joshua from Moses' times we're talking about, but Joshua was a governor under the king in those days. Now, there was a great city wall which surrounded Jerusalem at the time. And in this wall was a gate through which people could enter. And this gate was kept and guarded and upkept by this governor called Joshua. But this gate, at the top of the gate's tower, Joshua and others had been sacrificing to idols, and even charging others to do so as well before entering the city. Imagine if you're an Israelite or even a visitor coming to visit the holy city, the city of kings, and where the temple is. And the first thing you see when entering through the gates is people sacrificing to other gods. Well, Josiah isn't having it. He doesn't care if Josiah is a high official in the country. He breaks down the gate. Verse 13. The king also desecrated the high places that were east of Jerusalem, on the south of the hill of corruption, the ones Solomon, king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the vile goddess of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the vile god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the people of Ammon. Josiah is now not only undoing the wrongs done by his father and his grandfather, but he's going further back. He's getting rid of things Solomon built in Israel. But Josiah isn't done there. 2 Kings 23:21. The king gave this order to all the people: celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in the book of the covenant. So the Passover festival, done in remembrance of how God fought for Israel when they were slaves in Egypt, hadn't been kept in Israel for at least a generation. But Josiah isn't just reading or listening to the book of the law, he is applying it. In 2 Chronicles, it says, Josiah celebrated the Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem, and the Passover lamb was slaughtered on the 14th day of the first month. He appointed the priests to their duties and encouraged them in the service of the Lord's temple. So Josiah is reintroducing the Passover in the temple and throughout the land. It says he not only appoints the priests to do their duties, saying, do this, but that he encourages them in their service. Again, appearing to be a pretty good leader. Verse 3. He said to the Levites, who instructed all Israel and who had been consecrated to the Lord, put the sacred ark in the temple that Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, built. It is not to be carried around on your shoulders. Now serve the Lord your God and his people, Israel. Now, the sacred ark here is referring to the Ark of the Covenant. The ark was a specially designed wooden box, which inside held the original stone tablets on which the covenant law was written on. And the ark was meant to be kept in the temple, in the most holy place of the temple, where God's presence was meant to be. And the ark, as you can see, it's a box, and it served as a seat upon which God would be on top between the two cherubim that you see there. So the ark serves as God's throne. And of course, where God's throne is, his presence is. Now, the Israelites had seemingly in their history a bad practice of treating this ark, the Ark of the Covenant, a bit like a good luck charm. Sometimes when they went into battle, they would take the ark with them, thinking, if we have this with us, we will win. And the history of that is, at one point, they do end up losing the ark and the Philistines capturing it, but that's a whole other story. And Josiah is saying, look, stop using it in this way. It belongs here. Josiah now commands, put the ark back where it's meant to be. The king of Israel is acknowledging the highest king and saying, put his throne back where it belongs. So it's a big Passover. Not only the first one happening in years, but now the temple prayers and sin offerings can be done before the presence of God because the ark is there. Verse 7, Josiah provided for all the lay people who were there a total of 30,000 lambs and goats for the Passover offerings, and also 3,000 cattle, all from the king's own possessions. Josiah says, look, I want us to all come together to follow God, follow the covenant in the scrolls. Don't worry if you're poor and you can't afford to buy a lamb, to buy an offering to sacrifice for you and your family. I will provide the animals from my own pocket. You won't have anything getting in the way of you being able to come to God for forgiveness during Josiah's reign. But it seems that Josiah's actions, his leadership, does more than simply supply animals. It also inspires those around him. For it says in verse 8 and 9, his officials also contributed voluntarily to the people and the priests and Levites. Hilkiah, Zechariah, and Jehiel, the officials in charge of God's temple, gave the priests 2,600 Passover offerings and 300 cattle. Also Conaniah, along with Shemaiah and Nathaniel, his brothers, Hashabiah, Jael, and Jozabad, the leaders of the Levites, provided 5,000 Passover offerings and 500 heads of cattle for the Levites. Inspired by the king, these other priests and lay people are praying, not just praying, but paying for the people's sacrificial offerings out of their own pockets. So, Passover day comes, verse 16. So at that time, the entire service of the Lord was carried out for the celebration of the Passover, and the offering of burnt offerings on the altar of the Lord as King Josiah had ordered. Verse 18. The Passover had not been observed like this in Israel since the days of the prophet Samuel, and none of the kings of Israel had ever celebrated such a Passover as did Josiah, with the priests, the Levites, and all Judah and Israel who were there with the people of Jerusalem. This Passover was celebrated in the 18th year of Josiah's reign, so he's 26 at the time. And this is all confirmed as well in 2 Kings, where it sort of echoes, neither in the days of the judges who led Israel, nor in the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah had any such Passover been observed. Now, Josiah's grandfather, Manasseh, had been described as violent and doing evil in God's sight. Josiah's father, Ammon, had been described as following completely the ways of his father Manasseh and doing evil in the Lord's sight. But how is Josiah's life summed up at the end? He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. You barely need a basic understanding of psychology to know that one rotten person can poison a whole family. And in Josiah's family, the one he grew up in, it was as rotten as it gets. Josiah didn't get to choose who his father was. He didn't get to pick his grandfather. He didn't get to choose what family he was born into. But he did choose who he wanted to be. Against all odds, against what he'd been taught, against the pattern of his family, against his own people, he goes against the current And keep in mind, his father was murdered by his own officials, so Josiah may have feared retribution if he did something unpopular, and yet he goes ahead. Josiah walked away from what he'd come from. He simply said, "No, I'm not living like that." Like Josiah, we don't get to decide what family we're born into, nor the generational baggage and evil which we are loaded with. We don't get to choose our parents, our grandparents, our guardians, our home life, and we don't get to choose our upbringing. But this story right here is so powerful because it tells us as readers that no matter what situation you are born into, no matter what others have done before you don't have to be anyone's repeat. You can be the apple that falls far from the tree. Now, some have said, look, I need to show respect to my parents, whatever they're like, and even the Bible says, honor your father and mother. Now, I'm agreeing with this. But sometimes the best way to honor your mother and father is to be nothing like them. Josiah, he took a step by beginning to seek God. He reached out to God before even the book of the law was found, before he even cracked open what we would call a Bible. He was on a journey throughout his life where he tried to always do the right thing. He spent so much time dismantling and tearing down the ugly structures which his relatives had raised around him. And some here today may feel as though they are in a similar situation. Maybe family members or community structures created by those who have gone before you have raised ugly, destructive, violent nightmares in your life, things that serve evil and not God. And maybe you feel like you're spending half your life just trying to tear down all that mess that they've created. Well, the story of Josiah should be a monument to how God says to each of us, you are your own person, and I will treat you as such. You are not your parents. You don't have to become them. You are not stuck forever in a family pattern. Come, let's go. Let's go somewhere else, somewhere better. Let's start, you and I, something new together. And in this case, in the case of Josiah, think of how much healing and justice was brought to the whole country. How many lives were saved? Josiah began one of the biggest reforms in the history of Israel. And those reforms centered on the temple and reconnecting with God. And that's why when Josiah's story is told, the Bible doesn't record him as the son of Manasseh or Ammon. At the end it says, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and followed completely the ways of his father, David. And again in 2 Chronicles, in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, he began to seek the God of his father, David. Josiah, son of David. Even if you're born into a family, like Josiah was, that is destructive, when you seek God, you join a new family, a new line. You inherit another history, another legacy. And like the boy king, Josiah, you too are called a son or daughter of David.